Meena Kandasamy is a poet, translator, and activist. Her novel, The Gypsy Goddess, was published in 2014. This was her first novel, and she wrote it to break the rules of traditional storytelling. The book is about a real horror, the Keelvenmani massacre. On Christmas Day 1968, in the Tanjore district of Tamil Nadu, 44 landless Dalit farm workers were locked inside a small hut and burned alive. Most were women, children, and old men. Their crime? They had gone on strike to demand higher wages and basic respect from their upper caste landlords who had exploited them for generations. But here is the key. Kandasamy does not write a simple, straight history. She believes that ordinary storytelling cannot capture the shock of such extreme violence. She uses clever experimental techniques. She uses postmodern and metafictional strategies to show how official history fails the poor to reject the fake exotic India that sells well in the West and to build a lasting memorial for the victims without stealing their voice. Traditional history books and realistic novels pretend that language can show us the truth directly. They act like a clean window onto reality. But postmodern thinkers say this is a lie. History is not a pile of pure facts, it is always a story told by people with power. Kandasamy uses this idea to expose the gaps and lies in India's official records. After the Keelvenmani massacre, newspapers like The Hindu called it peasant clashes and agrarian unrest. These words hid the truth. It was brutal caste violence. Even leftist communist groups focused only on class and economics, ignoring that all 44 victims were Dalits. The courts used cold language, arguing over whether 42 or 44 people died, as if numbers mattered more than human beings. Against these powerful voices, the novel acts as a people's history. It shows how landlords, police, and judges secretly work together to hide the truth. When the state uses forgetting to build national pride, the experimental novel must step in to expose the wounds. One of the book's striking features is its use of metafiction. This means the novel constantly reminds you that it is a novel. The author does not hide behind an invisible godlike narrator. Instead, she invites you into her workshop, showing you her struggle. The book opens with a long section called Background. Here, instead of introducing characters, the narrator openly worries about how to tell this story correctly. She tries several fake beginnings like Once Upon a Time and then throws them away. She even directly challenges the reader. If you find this confusing, remember that I am struggling and you are also responsible for your own discomfort. Through this playful, angry style, Kandasamy attacks the typical Indian English novel that sells well abroad. She rejects the numbing effect of nostalgia or exotica, the demand for colorful, feel good stories about India. She refuses to turn Dalit suffering into an exotic product. She even mocks the idea of a book title calling on Derrida Chez Merida, a joke about the famous philosopher Derrida, to argue that a title doesn't need to make sense. She picks the Gypsy Goddess, a misleading, slightly exotic sounding name, as a final ironic joke on the reader. Another major part of Kandasamy's project is her fight with language. She rejects standard academic English, calling it an over intellectual tool that cannot capture the voice of the poor. To tell the story of the Keelvenmani laborers, she tears apart normal English and blends it with Tamil, She calls this hybrid language Tamanglish. The narrator proudly calls Tamanglish a crime against the language. This is not a mistake, it is a political act. For decades, mainstream critics dismissed Dalit writing as a narrow, angry, and not universal. Kandasamy turns this insult on its head. She says a true Dalit novel cannot speak in the smooth, polite voice of the oppressor. It must break language apart to show the physical reality of caste violence. This fits with the vision of B.R. Ambedkar, the great Dalit leader, an open, unyielding fight against exploitation and untouchability. Kandasamy's furious prose shatters the polite feelings of conservative literature. This brings us to a deep ethical question. How can a writer use irony, parody, and playfulness to describe real people being burned alive? Does humor risk disrespecting the dead? Kandasamy knows she's walking a tightrope. She switches styles on purpose. In the meta sections, she is ironic and mocking. But when she describes the actual massacre and the cruelty of the landlords, her writing becomes raw and direct. Why? If she wrote a simple, sad tragedy, readers could cry a little, feel pity, and then close the book with relief. By using a disruptive, multi layered form, she denies that comfort. The playful parts are not meant to minimize trauma, instead, they act as a shield. They constantly remind us that a book can never fully capture such horror. This forces readers to look at their own position as consumers of violence. It gives agency to the victims by showing the limits of the author's own medium. To understand how radical Kandasamy's book is, we must compare it to an earlier novel about the same massacre, Kurudi Punal, published in 1975. It was written by the Brahmin intellectual Indra Parthasarathi. Parthasarathi's novel reframed the murder of 44 Dalits as the result of one man's personal madness and sexual jealousy. It suggested that the killer, Gopala Krishna Naidu, acted out of individual obsession. Kandasamy completely rejects this. She calls it a trick to protect the caste system. In her book, the massacre was not an isolated outburst, it was a calculated act of caste supremacy, land ownership, and untouchability. The state, the landlords, and the courts all worked together. By rewriting this history from a Dalit feminist viewpoint, Kandasamy restores the massacre to its true context, a structural war against rising Dalit political power. Finally, the book uses myth in a clever way. The title refers to a local legend about 7 gypsy women who were murdered with their babies and later became a protective goddess. Kandasamy weaves this myth into the story, but not as magical realism or an escape. Instead, the myth stands for all the forgotten victims of caste violence across Indian history. The goddess represents a collective memory that refuses to be erased. This mythic memory is grounded in a real character called Mai, an old Dalit woman who survives this massacre. After the horror, it falls on Mai's shoulders to hold her village together. She does not speak in slogans or academic jargon. She simply endures. Mai is a living monument, a human archive of trauma and struggle. Through her, Kandasamy bridges the gap between clever narrative games and the raw material reality of survival. The Gypsy of Goddess is a masterclass in the politics of remembering. By combining the rule breaking tools of postmodern fiction with the fierce urgency of Dalit aesthetics, Kandasamy creates a new model for the political novel. She proves that when official history chooses to forget the suffering of the poor, literature must refuse to be a passive bystander. The book forces readers into an uncomfortable position. It demands that we look directly at open wounds, question sanitized headlines, and acknowledge the caste inequalities that still shape modern society. Through Tamanglish, Through her argument with upper caste writers and through her refusal to offer easy comfort, Kandasamy turns a 50-year-old tragedy into an urgent call for injustice. She shows us that true remembrance is not about silently mourning the dead, it is about using our stories to tear down the structures of oppression that continue to police the living.